I guess I'm moving ahead here. Let's move on to number 2, response, because I'm just moving right into it. Response, God the gentleman. It really is, the idea that Arminians have is God really kind of establishes with himself a gentlemanly agreement not to violate natural law and not to violate libertarian freedom, at least not very often. Why? Well, let's take natural law first. God's gentlemanly agreement in regard to natural law requires that God remain mostly hands-off over natural disasters, since it trivializes natural law to create them as laws and then micromanage them. Do you get the point? So if God puts in place natural law, let's take something like a hurricane, that takes place. If he puts in place natural law, so these laws govern the ways in which water vapor is evaporated and taken up into the sky, and clouds form, and heat from the earth rises, and all of this stuff functions according to natural law. Well, if all of that natural law happens then to bring about a hurricane or a tornado or a tsunami, well, goodness, if God is going to start micromanaging everything that happens to make sure that no flood ever takes place, or no hurricane ever takes place, or no tornado takes place, then why put natural law in place in the first place? Why not just micromanage all of it? Which is, by the way, basically what Jonathan Edwards says. His view is that God basically creates the world de novo, moment by moment. So quickly, I can't snap my fingers nearly fast enough. So quickly that it has this appearance of an ongoing, continuous existence of the universe. But in fact, it's a new universe every millisecond that God creates. It's called constant creation, was Edwards' view. So that's one way God could do it, is just he causes everything to happen directly. So Arminians don't want to hold that view. They want to rather say God creates a world, puts natural law in place, and so he lets it go. So when a hurricane happens, it's really true what those Christian spokespeople out there say, because they are Arminian. They say God had nothing to do with this. True enough, he stands there and watches it. He's hands off. That tornado, that tsunami, he stands there and watches it. Why? Because he made a gentlemanly agreement with himself that he would let natural law function. The minute you start micromanaging it, you might as well not have the laws. You just manage all of it yourself. Okay, now, the same basic principle is now true in regard to human affairs. Small letter B. God's gentlemanly agreement in regard to human affairs requires that God remain mostly hands-off over what free creatures choose to do. Why? Well, here it is. Since it trivializes their libertarian freedom to first give them such freedom and then micromanage their use of it. So again, you realize, boy, when God gives us libertarian freedom, we have the power of contrary choice. We can choose to do one thing or the other. Well, that means at that point, God basically says, I will leave it up to you to choose to do what you choose, and I won't interfere with that. It doesn't mean God can't interfere, but it does mean he rarely will interfere. And of course, you wonder, goodness, he didn't interfere with Hitler, did he? And he could have, obviously. He didn't interfere with Pol Pot, with Mussolini, with Stalin, with Mao. Goodness, 70 million Chinese died forced deaths, most of them through starvation, under Mao Zedong. 70 million. So you've got to ask yourself the question, if God doesn't intervene there, when is he going to? Is he going to intervene with the bully who's bothering you? With the boss you've got who's not treating you right? Yeah, look at Mao. I don't think so. You know, how bad does it have to be for God to say, you know, that's just too much. You know, I'm not going to let that happen. Wow. I mean, so here's bottom line. This is my small letter C. Who then is really in control of the world over most of what happens in nature and what happens in human affairs? What's the answer to that question? I mean, it is a really sobering question. Who is in control in what happens in nature? Random forces of natural law that God could govern. He could intervene. He could keep that flood from happening, that tornado from happening, that whatever from happening. He could do that. But in order to leave natural law with integrity, he's basically hands off. What about human affairs? Same thing. I mean, goodness, he gave us libertarian freedom. If he's going to respect our freedom, do you hear that sometimes from people? He respects us too much, you know, to step in and do something about this. Wow. So he respects us. He's made this gentlemanly agreement. Gives us libertarian freedom. Well, my friends, that means, wow, the vast majority of what happens every day of our lives in nature and in human affairs is governed not by God, but by forces of nature over which God exerts no control. Human free will choices over which God exerts no control. Honestly, I don't think Arminians have thought through carefully their own view. It is just unbelievable how close this is to deism. Now, it's not deistic because, you know, in deism, Thomas Jefferson's religion, you know, in deism, God creates the world like a watchmaker makes a watch. He winds it up and it ticks away and he just watches it go, you know. In deism, God is remote and distant. Well, that's not the God of Arminianism. The God of Arminianism cares and is loving and he's there and but boy, what does he do? What does he do? And the answer is pitiful little. Because he gives us freedom. He wants to leave our freedom intact, so he rarely intervenes. That means we make the choices of what happens in world affairs and in personal relationships. And God doesn't interfere. Wow. What happens in nature? Natural law functions. And God is watching it take place. So it is a very sobering conclusion. What kind of power does God exert in his providential oversight over human affairs? A power in which all that he really can do with human affairs is try to influence. It's similar to a liberal theology that's out there called process theology. It's similar, it's not the same. But in process theology, the only power that God has is what is called a power of persuasion. He can try to persuade people to do what he knows would be best to do. But he can never make anything happen. He can never stop anything from happening. The difference in Arminianism is he could make something happen, in principle, because he's omnipotent. He could stop something from happening, in principle, because he's omnipotent, but he will rarely do so because he's made a gentleman agreement not to interfere. So even though he's not the process God, functionally, it's awfully close. What does God have? The power of persuasion, for the most part. Okay, capital letter B, providence via divine foreknowledge in relation to human free choices and actions. If God foreknows, this is the Arminian argument from Jack Cottrell. Jack is a friend of mine too, teaches at Cincinnati Bible College. He served with me on the Council on Biblical Manhood and Womanhood. He's very conservative, but he is a committed Arminian, very, very strongly. I've elbowed him several times at the table at dinner, when we're at meetings together with questions, especially on this stuff right here. And because, boy, I tell you, there's no answer to this problem that we're about to talk about. Here's Jack Cottrell in his book, What the Bible Says About God the Ruler. If God foreknows all the choices that every person will make, he can make his own plans accordingly, fitting his purposes around these foreknown decisions and actions. So the Arminian says, the way in which God can exert some level of control in the world, even though he gives us libertarian freedom, is that he has the tremendous advantage of knowing in advance what we're going to choose to do. Given that foreknowledge, wow, he can make his own plans, anticipating what we're going to do. Kind of like if you were playing chess with somebody, and you knew every move they were going to make before they made it, you could make all of your plans to counter their moves and win the chess match, right? And so this is God. He knows in advance what we're going to do. That's strategically tremendously advantageous. Well, it sounds good, but keep listening. There are problems. The horns of the dilemma for the Arminian view of simple divine foreknowledge and divine providence. First of all, if God exerts real and active providential control, then the future is adjustable, and hence he cannot have known it. So this is one way you could go with Jack Cottrell's notion. If it's true that God can actually make adjustments to what's going to happen, he knows what we're going to do, he can act accordingly and adjust the outcome, then that means he cannot know in advance everything that's going to take place. Why? Because if he knows what will take place, then he cannot adjust what will take place. You see what I mean? So really, for this view to work, you could go the route of open theism that we're going to talk about tomorrow morning. Namely, that God doesn't know the future, and so then he kind of just works with what's given him moment by moment as time unfolds and makes his choices and his reactions to what takes place. You could think of it that way, but then you're an open theist. And Jack Cottrell's not going to go that way. But here's the other problem, small letter B. If, on the other hand, God possesses real and actual, exhaustive, meticulous foreknowledge of every detail about the future of the world before he creates it, then he cannot change any single feature, since he knows precisely what every feature will be. Now, get the significance of this. Jack Cottrell says, if God knows what's going to take place in the future, this is really advantageous to him. Why? Because then he can anticipate what we're going to do and make adjustments. But here's the problem with that. In classic Arminianism, how much does God foreknow of what will take place in the future before he creates the world? How much does he foreknow? Answer, everything. Right? He has exhaustive, meticulous foreknowledge. This is true for Arminians, this is true for Calvinists, this is true for the whole Christian tradition until open theism. Our classic Arminians are committed to the notion that God knows the future exhaustively before he creates the world. Well, now think about it.